what really strikes me about this book is the tone, and the tone is it's just stunning, and it's a little different from. I mean, the voice is the same, but it has changed slightly from book to book, and it's it talks to a lot of different people in this book, and then sometimes I think it's the poet talking to herself, and then sometimes I think it's the poet talking to the entire world. In fact, it's the great mother in all her compassion for humanity's errors and whatnot. But I wondered if you could just speak about the voice for a little bit. Well, maybe we should start actually with the first poem I wanted you to read was the Lightkeeper.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Lightkeeper, my penchant for visiting lighthouses. And as with all poems, there are several different subjects going on that emerge during the writing. This lighthouse is the Hook Lighthouse in Ireland. Okay. And it's right across the water from the Crook Lighthouse. So it possibly is that expression by hook or by crook came from deciding which lighthouse they were going to use to negotiate the passage.
Interesting.
So it contains the history of how lighthouses were lit.
Yes, and it's got that beautiful list in it, as you have wonderful lists in many of the poems.
There are quite a few. I hoped I didn't get carried away with the enumerative mode of listing, cataloging, litanies, and inventories. No. But you know, I do think I know why that's the case. But so I'll read Lightkeeper, and then we can talk. The Lightkeeper, a night without ships, foghorns calling into walled cloud, and you, still alive, drawn to the light, as if it were a fire kept by monks. Darkness once crusted with stars, but now death dark as you sail inward. Through wild gorse and sea wrack, through heather and torn wool, you ran, pulling me by the hand, so I might see this for once in my life. The spin and spin of light, the whirring of it, light in search of the lost. There since the era of fire, era of candles and hollow wick lamps, whale oil and solid wick, colza and lard, kerosene and carbide, the signal fires lighted on this perilous coast in the Tower of Hook. You say to me, stay awake. Be like the lens maker who died with his lungs full of glass. Be the yew in blossom when bees swarm. Be their amber cathedral, and even the ghosts of Cistercians will be kind to you. In a certain light, as after rain, in pearled clouds or the water beyond, seen or sensed water, sea or lake, you would stop still and gaze out for a long time. Also when fireflies opened and closed in the pines, and a star appeared, our only heaven. You taught me to live like this, that after death, it would be as it was before we were born. Nothing to be afraid, nothing but happiness, as unbearable as the dread from which it comes. Go toward the light always. Be without ships.
Oh, just get breathless about it. So, was there a particular person you had in mind in this poem?
It was a friend of mine who later died. We were both going through chemo at the same time for different reasons. And, you know, he had this idea that you needed when you were having chemo, in between each treatment, a change of sky. And so I was in Ireland, and he took me to see the Hook Lighthouse at 2 in the morning, because he said, you have to see them at night, because during the day they're just a building. And at night they're alive with light, and you can even hear the lamp move around and around, and you see the light cast out over the sea and then cast out over the sea. So he just wanted me to see one when it was dark enough, and I never would have gone alone in the middle of the night.
Was it making the noise?
I never would have visited the lighthouse in the middle of the night, but I did hear it make the noise. It went whoosh, whoosh, a kind of really interesting sound revolving with the light. And he's also the poet who inspired Museum of Stones. He's not a poet, he was a musician, really. He was an Irish musician, but he is the person who inspired Museum of Stones as well.
And also, I'm so glad you began the book with that, because I know you've been reading it a lot, so probably this one too, but the everlastingness of stones, they're older than cockroaches, and the whole idea of this world that we're in, that we don't know where it's going. But I wanted to ask you about the lines toward the end. I love the after death it would be as if it was before we were born, because I think many people actually believe that, although I think differently. But nothing but happiness.
We don't know how it was before we were born. We just can't remember it. It doesn't necessarily mean that we weren't beings in some way.
Yeah. But it won't hurt.
It won't hurt. It was a kind of assurance of, you don't remember before you were born, and it was all right.
Right,
so
right.
It will be all right again, Yes.
Yeah. That is comforting. But I do think wanted you to just kind of unpack these words, nothing but happiness, as unbearable as the dread from which it comes. The happiness comes from the dread.
It sort of means that you have to have darkness in order to have joy. You have to know the difference.
Yeah.
Emotions all come from each other, that things, very beautiful things, grow from difficulty.
Yes.
And so I think that's really...
That's perfect. It's a beautiful explanation. I love it. And there's so much in this book about the equation of opposites or something, that I think there's a mutable sort of liminal in and out of different countries, within the same couple of lines, and then an image that comes from somewhere else. And it's just so all encompassing, and this voice is so authentic and omniscient. And this "Be without ships" and "A night without ships" frame the poem in a way that you framed another one with the communion.
I think lighthouses will light the sea whether there are ships out there or not, They do it, they work in case there's someone out there, but it doesn't really, they don't stop just because the sea is empty off the coast in the moment. And I don't know exactly what the last line means. I think it has something to do with focusing on the light rather than anything else.
Right.
Be without other concerns, be without worry for those, for those ships, just be the light. Be the light rather than maybe. Although I don't know, the line came on its own.
Mm-hmm.
So some passages, some lines, many times in my poetry over the years, I really don't know what to say about them.
I know. I feel the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wanted to ask you. And this line, "Be like the lens maker who died with his lungs full of glass." That is magnificent. It's just magnificent. Um, so I love this poem, and I love the voice that goes through the book. And did you think of it like that? Like it was, you take on different personas, but there's still Carolyn there. And are you sometimes talking to yourself? Um,
I think so. These poems were written over a 17-year period,
yeah.
and they are the survivors of that 17-year period. So there are lots of poems that never made it. These are the ones that I kept. And then when it was time to assemble a manuscript, I got lucky because this poetry book was delayed a bit so that the memoir could be published. And so I wrote several more new poems because of that delay. And when I put all the poems on the table to look and see what sort of book this might be, if it even was a book, I began to see that over the course of these 17 years, there has been a kind of continuity in my consciousness because the poems are all speaking to each other. They share a constellation of imagery.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of water, boats, movement, voyages, migrations. And regardless of whether the person being addressed is whoever it is, and
Mm-hmm.
whether it's me or someone I know in particular, and I know the difference between those, because I know who these poems are written for, uh, the, the, the voice stays the same. And during those 17 years, I had a couple of real challenges in my life,
Right.
and one of them being cancer. And I think that was what gave me this book, those survivals
Yeah.
and the coming to terms and the coming to acceptance.
Acceptance and
So
surrender.
then when this was published, it was published on March 10th. And on March 11th, I gave a reading in Alabama. And the last thing I did was visit Helen Keller's house. And I went to her, I had a photograph taken with her water pump where
Oh,
she learned
that's
the
right. I
word for water.
remember from the movie.
And I got on an airplane and flew home, and I never left the house again, not until now.
It was the pandemic. Yeah.
It was the pandemic. And when I read the book now, at first I thought, oh, my book comes out right at the beginning of the lockdown. Exactly.
Yeah.
And we all locked down around the 12th of March. And then I read it again and I thought, oh, this is a book for now. This is what I was writing toward all this time.
It's
The
just,
book for now. And so I felt at peace about it. I thought, okay, it's a book for now. It's going to find its way in other ways, not the usual ways. And it will do that without my help, in the usual ways, communing with a live audience. And
it's perfect because it's so much of the book is awakening us at the same time, seeing your um, maturity over a long period of time. I was looking back to A Country Between Us, and the poem, the voice there was more severe. It was still your voice, but um, this voice has a kind of tenderness and wistfulness and great compassion that I think, you come to after going through
it takes some
dark
time.
days. Yeah. Mhm.
I was a very intense during the period of writing The Country Between Us because I
Mm.
was really in the midst of all of that. And it was I was so engaged and I was unaware of how I had been affected by the experiences that I had. I wasn't paying any attention to that. And the poems had a kind of urgency, a youthful energy and urgency about them. And I read it now and I remember her, but I no longer have her sensibility in the same way. When I was writing the memoir, What You Have Heard Is True, I tried to create my young self as a character, and she narrated it. You know, I had to go back and re-inhabit myself at a young age, and that required warts and all. You know, that required me to understand how self-absorbed I sometimes was, and how petulant and how cheeky and argumentative and everything else. And so I put that, I let her act that out in the book. And I wrote about my guide and mentor and friend of many years, Leonel Gomez. And I was able to create his character. He's funny and mysterious and brilliant, and it's hard to describe, but I tried to get him all there. And
I think he came across as just.
And this memoir took 15 years to write.
Well, you had the italics and then regular print.
Yeah, the narrative was in the, I put inside, toward the end of writing it, I wrote 4 different versions of it over 15 years. And I finally had the last version. And I remember I couldn't finish it. I had to build a bridge between the end and a little part. I had to build a 50-page bridge. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what to do. I had to choose scenes. I had to figure out how to write it. And I gave myself finally 2 weeks I was at a residency, and I said, you've been spending 15 years on this. You either have to finish it in this 2 weeks, or you have to put it away and accept that you cannot do this. And fortunately, a few days before the residency ended, I finished it. And the thing about this was that all the while I was writing this, I was slowly also writing these poems. And these poems became my refuge from my own memoir. And then toward the end of writing, I found a box, and in the box were my notebooks that I'd kept in El Salvador. And I started reading them. And at first I thought, oh, this is a treasure trove of information. You know, I can use this as research for the rest of my memoir. And then I thought, no, these are strangely written. I should just transcribe them as they are and not rewrite them in the calm voice of the narrator, you know. So I put them in, I labeled them all with the title Written in Pencil,
right?
Because they were written in pencil. I like writing in pencil because you can erase it. And so I
we had a sense of being there as it was happening.
That was the thing. I realized it was the language of that moment, and I couldn't recreate that, or I didn't want to describe it at a remove. So what I decided finally that made the book possible was that I would write it with the reader never knowing more than I knew at the time. And so they would go on the journey with me. And it would, but what happened with the poetry is the poetry waited patiently in the wings, you know, and I would write poems, and then I'd go back to the memoir, and then I'd stop the memoir for a while and write poems again. And it was, that was the respiration of those years. And at first I thought, well, these poems are so various, you know, there's so many different people and so many different times and places. But that doesn't matter, because I think finally they're talking to each other. They're in conversation. And it required that length of time passing to get these poems. They could not be written quickly or in, you know, a couple of years. I've always been slow with poetry books. I mean, there's always been at least 7 years between my poetry books. Sometimes 10, but 17, I even think is excessive, you know. And I hope, because I'm
books at the same time.
Because I'm 70, I hope I don't take that much time again, because I might not have that much time. So I've decided to shoulder to grindstone and don't be so inclined to revise forever and ever and ever, you know. Let them go a little earlier. That's what I'm hoping to do. I would have to change a lifetime of habits, but maybe I can.
I want you to read, I have so many favorites here, but Ashes to,
Oh, Ashes to Izalco. Yeah, this is okay.
how do you say it?
Ashes to Izalco. Here's an interesting thing. Clarivel Alegria, the woman poet that I first translated, who was the cousin of Leonel, which is how I met him, she published a novel when she was young called Ashes from Izalco. And
I
he had
read
grown up at the foot of that volcano, in the foothills of it. And so this was after Leonel died.
So what country is it in?
Pardon?
What country is it in?
Oh, she was born in Nicaragua, but grew up in El Salvador. So Ashes from Izalco was a novel that was a kind of thinly disguised account of her upbringing during a revolutionary period in El Salvador. And because it's thinly disguised, she wound up having to live outside of El Salvador for the rest of her life.
In Mallorca, right?
She was in Argentina and many places, but Mallorca was where she lived. And then finally she came back to Central America and lived in Nicaragua at the end of her life. She had been born there, so that was the right place for her.
But you took Lionel's ashes to El Salvador.
Leonel died in El Salvador. Leonel died there. He died there on Thanksgiving Eve, 2009. I had been with him the week before he died. I didn't know he was dying.
Oh.
I went home and I got the call and I flew back.
Mm-hmm.
And he was cremated. We had a funeral and then he was cremated, and we took his ashes to the Wazapa volcano, which is where most of the war had been fought. And I was saying ashes to Izalco, and I didn't mean that. It's ashes to Wazapa. Anyway, this is where we scatter his ashes. This is after his life is over, and it recalls images from the war. So I'll read it. It was read at a memorial service for him about a year after his death.
And he had 2 daughters, right?
Yes, he has 2 daughters, and I live very close by to one of them, who now lives in the United States and is an American, and so we're really close. And she just lives up the road a little ways, coincidentally. So one of those little girls at the beginning of my memoir is now my neighbor in adult life.
Right. That's wonderful, and especially after not to get too distracted, but the story of Alex.
Yeah.
Who came and stayed with you and then went back.
Yes. Yeah, it was an experience for me because I got to get to know one of the killers. Alex was a death squad person.
Right.
And in the memoir, you're told why he's with me in my house. But it was quite a window onto that world. And
it was fascinating part of the book.
Yeah, that was an amazing experience for our household. And I remember my son was little. He was only 4 or 5 years old when Alex was with us. And he taught Sean to play chess, because he wanted to pass the time, and he knew he loved chess, and he taught Sean how to move the pieces, even though Sean was really little. And years later, I asked Sean, I was worried, and I thought, oh, maybe it wasn't so good to have someone like that in the house when Sean was little. And I said, do you remember that man? After he'd grown up, I asked Sean this. And he said, no, Mom, I don't remember him, but I always wondered how I learned to play chess, which I loved. So ashes to Wazapa. Oh, Leonel was very fat, I should say. Everyone coped with stress differently, but Leonel coped by eating ice cream and things. And so he was quite a heavy man by the end of his life. Your cinerary box was light, but filled with you, it weighed 8 pounds. Nevertheless, we each wanted our turn, carrying you up the mountain. We passed the roofless chapel, the crater, the graves of the youngest, the camping place, the secret paths, the impossible stone road. We came upon the shivering trees where the magical foreign doctor was said to dig out bullets with a penknife and supply the children with iron by dipping rusty nails in water. We came upon the past where the holes were dug, and if you dug there now, you'd fill quite a sack with bones. We don't stop to dig there. We carried your box to another place, not as far as we would have liked, but far enough, where we all had our pictures taken with you, and then your box posed with your former truck that will now belong to the priest you saved from prison. The truck seemed to know what had happened. We spent a long time piling stones around the trees. Even the mayor, who was once a fighter himself in these hills, piled stones. Then, with cupped hands, we tossed your remains into a coppice of cedars. You flew a little. Your soft ash flew, settling on the stones under the trees. A camouflage moth alighted on the tree where most of you fell, and there your friend worked his machete until a cross appeared, and within it a Christ of sap and grain. The moth then vanished into the jacaranda, and dragonflies arrived, hovering. Then from nowhere, butterflies rained into the coppice, blue mariposas, as they sometimes do into the roofless chapel. And as dragonflies whirred above us, a camouflage moth held still with its wings open, and the mariposas rose and fell until all was dust and wings. You in flight, leaving a life without a day not given to others, leaving us to stand in a sunlit clearing of butterflies and ash where your soul is loosed.
That is so beautiful.
Thank you. It makes me cry, this poem, because everything in this poem happened when we scattered his ashes. And I have pictures, I have photographs of the cross. It was so weird because when he cut the bark from the cross to form the cross on the tree, which I didn't think he should do because I thought it was wounding the tree,
Right.
this Jesus image came through. And my husband said to me, "Do you see that?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm going to photograph it." And I said, "Okay." So he did. We have like dozens of pictures of this thing. And eventually they tell me it faded away. You don't see it anymore. But we have photographs of it. And it was very weird.
It's like that cloth from Veronica.
Yeah, it looked like that. It looked like Turin or something. And I thought, okay, you know, I was very aghast at that. And I just
butterflies,
things like that.
butterflies are always associated with the soul leaving.
Yes. And there were so many of them. And the whole time we were hiking up that volcano, it was really hot. We couldn't take the vehicles very far because there were too many stones in the road. And it was really hot and there weren't any butterflies. It was just beating sun. But when we got there to this place, when we stopped and we took the ashes out, all of a sudden they were everywhere.
Wow.
And I thought, I mean, they were blue, they were beautiful. I don't know what kind they were because I'm not an expert on that. But and then there were these big moths with wings like the size of your hand. And they look, I called them camouflage moths because they look like they're wearing camouflage. They're kind of brown and mottled and everything. And because that was a place where so many people did wear camouflage. So
yeah.
But they were just on the tree, like pinned to the tree with their wings open, just waiting, waiting, waiting. And then when this little squadron of dragonflies came, they reminded me of little helicopters, you know, they were just coming. There was a bunch of them just came through, like, here we are doing a flyover, you know. It was like all of those insects attended his funeral service, his burial service.
It's yeah, the images are so powerful. And I love the trucks seem to know what had happened.
Yeah, the truck, you know how they have almost
The truck is all through your memoir.
yeah, the truck. That's because the truck. A lot of our scenes in the memoir take place in that thing,
Right.
and they have the headlights and the grill. It makes it look like they have a little face. So as we put it on his box on the hood of the truck, and I stood back to take the picture, the truck looked like it was looking at me, you know, and I thought, yeah, even the truck knows what's going on here, you know.
And it went to this priest.
Yeah,
Who
Padre Borgera.
had a lot of
Yeah.
friends. Yeah, the stories are amazing in the memoir. And the poetry is just so beautiful. And I have to comment on the boatman because some people have compared it paired it with the colonel.
Oh, that's interesting.
I know. I didn't quite see that, but I thought of, Charon ferrying people. So many of the poems take place on water, near water,
Yeah.
between here and there. And I'm curious about the number 31 because I just wondered if it was a random number that you chose, but
Oh, it was the number he told me. He said we were 31 people, 31.
Because in numerology it's a 4, which is foundation, and they were trying to find a foundation in this poem.
Yes,
I
that's
wonder
interesting.
if
I
that
didn't know that.
related. Yeah,
So it was a gift from the universe. There are a lot of things in poems that arrive
I
at.
know. It's so great when that happens. It's like you are in touch with something.
So I met him. I got a 1 semester teaching residency at Marquette, and in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was a winter residency. Well, of course, and of course, Milwaukee, the weather is just really harsh. And I was living in a hotel downtown, and I would mostly walk. It wasn't that far to the campus, but when it was really cold and snowy, I didn't want to walk. So I would hail a taxi cab. And there's a lot of taxi cabs in downtown Milwaukee because, people go to the airport, they come to the hotels. And this one driver kept picking me up out of just randomly, and he said to me one day, he said, I've driven you before. And I said, I know, I remember you. And then it happened again. And that time it was like a blizzard. It was snowing, snowing, snowing. So when he pulled up in front of the hotel, we just sat in the car. And he said, I'm going to tell you, because I told him I was a poet. He asked me, what are you doing at Marquette? I said, I'm a poet. I'm teaching there for a semester. And I remember the snow falling on the cab. It just covered the windshield. We were inside this snow globe. And he said, I'm going to tell you how I got here. If you promise someday you will write it because you're a poet. And I was scared because I thought, I don't know if I'm going to be able to write it because I can't decide when I sit down to write a poem what it's going to be about. And many things I wished I could write about over the years, and I've never been able to. So I thought this was going to be one of them.
Where
And
was he from?
he was from Homs in Syria.
I thought that.
And so it was called City. Its name was Mother of the Poor. And all the details were the details he gave me about it, including that there is a Hotel Homs apparently near Piazza di Spagna, and all the things he said about Homs. But of course, Homs was completely destroyed by aerial bombing. And it was one of the most devastating crimes against humanity of recent years, what happened to Homs. No one interfered. It was absolutely demolished. And so he talked about his boat trip, and it was he who said, "I'm driving a taxi at the end of the world."
Wow.
And I put boatman there because I thought about Charon and the ferryman,
Yeah.
and he really did believe the world was coming to an end. I don't know why, but he gave me his card, and that was the last time I ever saw him. And then I lost the card somehow. And so I can't send him the book.
It's like meeting one of those angels who pops in and then you never can find them again.
I could recognize him if I went to Milwaukee and looked at all the cab drivers' faces,
Was
but
was he young?
he was pretty young. Yeah, I would say he was in his maybe early 40s somewhere. Tall, thin, early 40s. And he knew he was never probably going back. There's a lot of refugee taxi drivers in our country.
Yeah.
One of the jobs you can get, and there were lots of them, but he picked me up 4 or 5 times, and that's just weird because
It is.
there's 100 taxi cabs floating around at any given time, you know.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
finally, that's why he told me the story, because he also thought there must be a reason that we keep seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Maybe
so
maybe he'll remember your name and find the book.
maybe he will. Maybe I wrote my contact information down for him. He gave me his card with his name and the cab company. I've looked everywhere. I don't throw anything away, so someday I may find it. But I was going back and forth from Milwaukee to home
It's
all
in
the
the room.
in a room. Yeah.
Look in the room.
Thank you for asking me the backstory of that.
Yeah, that elucidates a lot.
The only thing I can think of about the comparison to the Colonel is that it's a specific man talking to me. It's a narrative, it's a story, and it has a really harsh detail in it having to do with a human body. Other than that, they're very far apart. This man was like an angel, you know? He,
Yeah.
I'm not saying he was an angel. I'm saying he was like an angel in that he appeared mysteriously in my life several times, and he told the story as if he were narrating from very far away something extremely painful and talking about that baby in the
Is,
sea.
is this because there was an image that went very viral on the internet of this 2-year-old Syrian boy. I think it was on the edge of Turkey. It was a
Yeah, he washed
photograph.
up on the beach. He was on in the sand.
But
This
is
was
this
a
the
different
same?
child. This child was pulled out of the middle of the sea in the water.
Oh,
And he said that child was not from their boat. It was from another boat. And they saw it drifting in the water and they pulled it into their boat and its eyes were gone, you know,
mm,
and it was face down. I mean, a child can have a life vest on, but it doesn't mean that the child will be held upright. I mean, they can, too little, they can't, you know, something overcame the child was face down. So it wasn't alive, of course. And he never forgot it. That was what he wanted to tell me about the mystery of coming across a baby in the ocean. But he said, you know, so many thousands of people drown
yeah.
that many, many children also, many. And it was very disturbing to him, more disturbing than the destruction of Homs, I think, was what happened on that boat. And he didn't understand why the world was so cold hearted toward the people in the boats, you know, who were trying to escape with their lives. And
Of course.
it was very discouraging to him and to me to hear it, that the lack of compassion in humanity.
Where were they trying to get to?
Well, you know, they were trying to get to Europe, to Western Europe. He didn't tell me how he came to the United
How he
States.
actually got there. Yeah.
I don't know how he actually got to Milwaukee, of all places. You know, it just seemed odd. If I'd seen him in New York, I could say, okay, there's a lot of refugees in New York. He got all the way to Wisconsin. And yeah, they were just trying to get to a country that would be safe, where they could make a life somehow, because, you know, they knew they couldn't go back to that part of the world. And the irony is that, you know, we've deployed troops in that part of the world in many countries, and we've supported over the years dictatorial regimes. And, you know,
Yeah.
these people are fleeing conditions that the world could have improved eons ago, you know.
Yeah, it's tragic, and so much of dealing. You've dealt so much with tragedy. That was another thing I wanted to ask you. I had read something that Larry Levis had said about your poetry, and the beauty of bearing, the worst. That there was beauty in able to bear that. And I think I have the quote.
You have really read a lot of things to
Yeah.
find
I
that
also,
by Larry. Wow.
there's this poet, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Rosaszewicz is Polish. I think he's in one of your books.
Rosowitz, Tedzieus Rosowitz, yeah.
Yeah, my mother was Polish, so I'm half Polish.
Okay, yeah.
And there's something in the poems that he writes that are so spare, because I think it's like all the Holocaust poetry. You can't, you go back to basics. Like I have one of his books, and he's like, here is a table, here is a knife, here's, just naming things like, this is real, I'm okay for this moment,
It's the
but
taking of inventories when you're traumatized. Gunther Eick, who was a prisoner of war, a German prisoner of war, had one that was called, he said, this is my cup, this is my plate, here's my linen, something in the linen sack. And he ends it with, this is my thread, which is, he says, here, this is my pencil with which I write down the verses at night that I make during the day. So this thing of enumeration, you've just given me an insight here. People who go through trauma often tell themselves, okay, I still have this, I still have that.
mhm.
Still a human being, I have a jacket on, maybe that's why there's so many lists. And
Yeah, it's the list. Yeah, objects seem to be witnesses as well. And so there's an interconnectedness between the
right.
objects that are observed and the attention to that. But I wanted to get Larry's quote right. He said, he talks about that the readers are disgraced with some of your work. And I think he's pretty much thinking of Country Between Us, because he compares it to Goya's Disasters of War. And he says the effect of being disgraced is to make the viewer or the reader more conscious, more human, more capable of bearing pain and perceiving the beauty of bearing it. And so I think that whole concept of bearing the pain and the beautiful ruins, are ruins beautiful? Yes, they are for some of the history that they contain, the stories that they contain, and that they outlasted, and they're tragic as well. So I just wondered about that, how you felt about bearing the pain.
Larry wrote that at a time when The Country Between Us was really under attack for being political, they
Yeah.
thought at the time. And at the time, poets thought you absolutely should not be political at all in any of your work, really. And that's hard to imagine in our period now. But Larry came to the book's defense and was trying to make an argument, beyond petty politics. And for me, I was always very influenced by poets of Eastern and Central Europe and Russia. My family, my father's family, is from former Czechoslovakia. And I read Anna Akhmatova all the time. She was my model of how to be in the world, and
Mhm.
she was stoical, and she wrote beautifully, and she was dignified. And I wanted someday when I grew up to be dignified, I mean, this was the goal, not to break down, not to be self-absorbed, not to be self-concerned, not to be overly emotional, but to be dignified.
Mhm.
And then Larry understood, Larry understood that book on a different level than others. I admired his poetry enormously. I still turn to it all the time. He has a great poem called Sensationalism, and it all came from him looking at a Joseph Kudelka photograph, and he imagines a whole history in it.
I have to look that up. I have his.
Look at Sensationalism. I
Yeah.
can't remember which book it's in right now, but you'll
I have
find
a complete one.
yeah, you'll find it. It's really
You, what was I going to say? You gave us an assignment once at Palm Beach Poetry Festival. You used one of his poems of mixing up a work of art and then an experience.
this was Sensationalism. It was that
That's
white
the one?
poem with the white horse, and the man is squatting
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
The horse. That's the one. It's so I gave it to you before. I
Right.
love the Palm Beach Festival. It's wonderful.
Oh, I hope you come back.
I think so too. I hope everyone survives this pandemic. I know it's virtual this
I
year.
know, I know. The pandemic is so, well, if it wasn't so annoying, it's so fascinating. to
Fascinating and it's
see
sad,
time, yeah.
tragic, and it was coming all along. They've been telling us for years it was on its way.
Yeah,
We're overdue for a pandemic, and a lot of people who are in a position to know said this was the thing they most dreaded. And how deadly would it be? You know, it could have been very deadly. Instead, it's deadly, but it's avoidable and you can survive it. But they can imagine a pandemic where no one would survive it, you know. So this is really endurable, but hard. Poets House just closed in New York.
oh, really?
Closed down, they indefinitely. Cultural institutions are having a lot of trouble surviving.
I know.
And so poetry will survive, and we will get through this, and we will be in another place not too long from now.
Yeah, but again, the beauty of bearing it is, I mean, there's so many pandemic poems now online. I wrote mine really early, but I keep seeing them and seeing them, and
I haven't written any pandemic poems.
I think there's a grand design for it, but people are having to say what's important.
I think it's helping people to write these poems. And for me, what I know about the generations, several generations that endured this pandemic simultaneously all over the world, is that for a long time, art and poetry, regardless of what it's about, is going to bear the trace of the pandemic.
Mm.
In other words, it's going to be informing the sensibility of everyone who's alive for the rest of their lives. It will be there in the background.
All these kids growing up in
The pandemic and people being isolated, the experience of isolation, which is not so easy for some people. For an introverted poet, it's not so hard. You know, I've made good use of my time. I feel now I don't have the pressure to go out, which is wonderful. But you know, it's hard for people, and it's been also devastating losses for some families and devastating economic losses, and it will affect everyone alive for the rest of their lives in some way. And we will come through, and we will live in its aftermath, and we will take up our lives again. And I hope that we take them up in a new way, so that we, with more consciousness and restraint and care for our planet.
Well, your book speaks to that. I mean, that is what you do. You have just have had such an amazing life so far, and you know, whatever you do next.
Well,
I have a 5-year-old grandchild, and she is going to school, nursery school or kindergarten actually, and there's 4 kids in her class because nobody is sending them the school, and she'll talk about, oh yeah, it's the coronavirus. I'm thinking,
She knows the word. Yeah.
yeah, and I can't see her.
So she has a cohort of 4 kids in her class.
Yeah.
Maybe
So
that will protect her, you
they'll
know.
be bonded, yeah, and wonderful teachers, and Rhode Island. They're in Rhode Island, so they're very
Oh, there's
conscious.
a lot of virus in Rhode Island right now.
Yeah, I know, but it is one of the blue states, at least up there.
Yeah, they'll have they do mask more in the blue states
Yeah.
and take more precautions like they do here where I live in Maryland.
Hmm.
I'm so sad that it ever became a political symbol. It never had to be a political symbol. And when you think about it, when you go into the hospital for surgery, all of the people doing the surgery are masked, and you wouldn't want it otherwise. So it's medical masks are, you know, an ordinary feature of medical care and life. So to have this turn into some kind of symbol politically, it just didn't have to be this way. Right? I mean, we would never tell our surgeon, take that mask off while you operate on me.
No, it's part of the tragedy.
Now we know that whenever anyone sees this, it will always be a pandemic interview.
Oh gosh, well, we're going to see what happens this winter. Yeah, I mean, just, and then I read uh, the boatman, and the one about, sorry, there's just well, I love The Crossing, because I love the end of it especially. But Report from an Island, that's a really important poem.
It's a newer poem in the book, Report from the Island. It's a
It's page 9, I think.
yeah, it goes back and forth. Okay, I was in Indonesia for a conference on plastics in the ocean. And at that time, the airplane went down, Lion Air, and also the geckos were out. So there was a mysterious thing that I thought was a bird, but it was a gecko. Anyway, this is the poem. It takes place on an island in Indonesia, and it's really, well, Report from an Island. Sea washes the sands in a frill of salt and a yes sound. We lie beneath palms under the star constellations of the global south. Across, a sword pointing upward. Through frangipani trees, a light wind. Bats foraging. Foreigners smoke the bats out by burning coconuts, calling this the bat problem. Or they set out poisonous fruit. The gecko hides under a banana leaf. So far, nothing is said. A gecko, mistaken for a bird that sings in the night. It is no bird. A healer blows smoke into the wound, sees through flesh to a bone once broken. In the sea, they say, there is an island made of bottles and other trash. Plastic bags become clouds, and the air, a place for opportunistic birds. 1.5 million plastic pounds make their way there every hour. The pellets are eggs to the seabirds, and the bags jellyfish to the turtle. So it is with diapers, shampoo, razors, and snack wrappers, soda rings, and six-pack holders. Even the sacks to carry it all home flows to the sea. Wind has lofted the water into a distant city, according to news reports. Most of that city submerged now with fish in the streets. It is no bird. The man hasn't sold any of his carved dolphins. Geckos don't sing. The vendor of sarongs hasn't sold a single one. Prow, the boats are called throughout this archipelago. Spider-looking, soft-motored, waiting at dawn. Geckos can't blink, so they lick their own eyes to keep them wet. Their bite is gentle. They eat mealworms and crickets. This is why no crickets sing. No one talks about it, but people look out to the sea, toward where the plane went down. There is time to imagine. 189 souls buckled to their seats on the seafloor. The wind too much for the plane. The gecko now at the door. After the earthquake, people moved into the family tombs. Many graves now have light and running water. Others live at the dumps in trash cities, where there is work sorting plastic, metal, glass, tantalum from cell phones and precious earths. This work is slow. A low hum of ordinary life drills into the mind, like the sound of insects devouring a roof. There is no hope for it. There is only the sea and its yes, lights in the city of the dead, and a plastic island that must, from space, appear to be a palace.